also it's a actually for-profit publisher. So for those of you who are watching the stream, too bad for you guys that you're not here, because you will they will get something that you will not be able to get. But we'll get back to that later on, and we'll decide whether that is ethical to actually treat people who are remotely connected different than the people who are actually in the audience. Okay, so ethics, very tough subject, as you probably know. How many of you have ever had a sort of a tutorial or anything about ethics? Nada? Yeah, well, obviously you have. You're the expert here, but I'll give the lecture. That's the difference. Okay, someone had sort of a little wavy hand here, probably not totally sure whether you'd had it or not. Okay, so this will, for many of you, be very new. And ethics is one of these things that is very difficult to explain. It's not quantized in the same way as many of these other things that we're used to deal with. Anyway, so before I get started, I will give a little bit background of where I'm from, and you will hopefully at the end understand why I'm giving this presentation, because it has something to do with ethics. But to put things in perspective, okay, so I come from the Netherlands. Actually, it's called the Kingdom of the Netherlands because it consists out of more than one country. So we have sort of what we call the main base down here, and then we have a bunch of smaller islands off the coast of South America. They're called the ABC Islands, close to the coast of Venezuela. Some of them are independent countries, some of them are part of the rest here, and actually supposedly being sort of independent cities within this. So down here we have Brazil, obviously. China is on the other side, another big area. So just to give you an impression, probably all of you know the Netherlands. But just to give you an impression, the Netherlands is from here to up there. So down here we have a place called Maastricht. And up here we have Groningen, and Lauwens is actually from up here. And if you have to go from here to there, in China you would say you can do that in an hour because it's only 300 kilometers, because they're very fast trains. We don't have that, but you do that in 2.5, 3 hours. But first you have to go to this particular place, which is actually the nodal point for almost all trains, and that's the town of Utrecht, where I live. An old town actually on the border between the Roman Empire back when there was a Roman Empire that actually decided to do that along the Rhine here. So as you can tell, there is a lot of rivers coming into the Netherlands, and we'll get back to that in a second. But just to sort of give you an impression about the size of Brazil compared to the Netherlands. So the Brazil is about 8.5 million square kilometers. The Kingdom of the Netherlands is about 41,000 square kilometers. So if you can sort of find the area ratios, you can figure out that if we took the population of the Netherlands and multiplied by that number, we would get to a huge number, much, much larger than the population of the Federative Republic of Brazil. So population density is very high. Actually, the population density here is absolutely the highest. There are not that many people living here. So in that area, exactly where all the rivers are coming together, that's actually where most people live. About 12 to 13 million people live in that. So essentially, that's one big city. So if you drive there, it feels very much like a city, and we don't have many high-rises, so a lot of people and very spread out. But if you put it in the right perspective, this is about the size. But, you know, being from the Netherlands, we don't like to be very modest. So we don't like to show it like that. We want to have it as big as the other one. But there is one thing that is very curious about the Netherlands. As a matter of fact, of the 41,000 square kilometers I mentioned, there's about 40% of those that are man-made, made by man, and hundreds of years ago. And they did that by building dikes and pumping. So all the windmills you've probably seen, and if you go to Alhambra, if you probably know that, down by São Paulo, you'll also see a lot of windmills and tulips and stuff like that. The windmills are actually used for a number of things, but one of them being pumping water out. As a matter of fact, in the current sea level, 30% of the Netherlands is below sea level. So when you land in Amsterdam at Schiphol Airport, you will actually land at about -6 meters, 6 to 7 meters under sea level. So if you have the chance, and there are 2 levels in the plane, take the upper level. If you can afford it, because most often it's business class. But then you'll save if you land and the dike is broke in the meantime. But this requires a lot of collaboration, a lot of close collaboration between people. So there is a lot of looking at each other and make sure that we do the right thing, and a lot of checks and balances about ethics, but corruption, things like that. So people are very much aware of each other, because we need each other to keep these pumps going. Just imagine that one day they would not. We would be, in deep trouble. So you will probably think now these days, a lot of people would be very concerned about global warming and sea level going up. As a matter of fact, it doesn't play much of a role in the discussion in the Netherlands. And why is that? That is simply because building another 2 meters on dikes that are already 15 meters doesn't matter much. I mean, it's something you have to do, but we know how to do it. So for those of you who would live in an area with a big river, oh, wait a second, you have a big river here. And you get these floodings coming up and down because the river would actually change. It's very handy to have these regulations of this. So we are very dependent on this. So now you're probably asking yourself, where I'm going with this? Well, for those of you who know about space stations and stuff like that, here we have the astronaut up in space, and he says, Houston, you have a problem, because here you see all the tornadoes coming in. You're very lucky living very close to the equator, so you don't get a lot of these. But when you live to the north or to the south, you can actually get some of these tornadoes coming in. Here we call them tornadoes in the US, and they call them typhoons, but they are essentially the same thing. Seawater heats up, in this particular case, off the coast of Africa, and it comes in. And as you probably know, we are about in the hurricane season now in the US, and they have had a few already. As a matter of fact, they ended up here. But last year in August, there was one down in close to Dallas. And there was so much water, because the water is not from the bay of the Gulf of Mexico. It's actually rainwater. But there was so much water that even the freeways got flooded in Dallas. Have you ever seen this picture? No? Okay. There was so much water on the freeway, and obviously because the freeway was a little bit lower than the rest, but this is how much water. There's one slight problem with this picture. What is that? It's a trick. What do you mean by a trick? The picture is for real. The shark is fake. But I didn't know you meant the shark. You could mean that maybe the car was fake, or the mirror was fake, or the rain was fake. You're absolutely right. Well, maybe you meant the shark, but you didn't say that, right? You know that. As a reviewer, you have to be very precise when you give a review, okay? Mention the mistakes. In this particular case, the mistake is the shark. The shark is fake. The shark is the type that actually lives off the coast of South Africa. So it doesn't even appear in the Gulf of Mexico. So this will be my representation of fake science and problems with ethics. That is, you have something that looks so real that if you didn't know and you were not smart enough, you would believe it. So someone was so creative to put a shark in there using a program called Photoshop, and some very creative scientists have created this program so you can actually get all kinds of ripples on it so it looks just like the way it should be. Okay? So whenever you hear someone talking about fake science, think of a shark on the freeway, okay? So if I wake you up tonight and I say shark, you say fake science, okay? Agreed? Okay. Now, so let's go in and then really talk about ethics. Unfortunately, this is one of these subjects that are very difficult to explain in a few words, but I'll try that by using an old-fashioned book called Merriam-Webster. And the one I'm going to use is called the 2B edition of ethics, which is the plural word of ethic. And it's the principle of conduct governing an individual or a group, and that we call professional ethics, okay? The yellow, I've done. But this is the definition I'm going to do. So we as professionals, we as scientists, have a certain ethics. We have countries, and we have laws in those countries. We have some international conventions, they're almost laws. And ethics are the things that have not been written up very clearly and is definitely not a law. So you can think of, if you want to talk in Phys Rev B terms, you would talk about laws being the solid version of ethics. It's solidified. It's cast in concrete, is stone, okay? Ethics is the rest, the fuzzy thing. And fuzzy things means that we have to discuss it, a little bit more elaborate. So now we've done that, I'll ask you some questions about ethics. But before I do that, we should probably know the definition of ethics. So today we are in Natal, Christmas. There are 2 days a year that you get a gift most often. That is Christmas, and that is on your birthday. And it so happens that one of the participants, one of the speakers today, is her birthday today. So of course, when it's your birthday, you should also have a gift. So I spent hours and hours yesterday on the beach trying to find a gift for you. Well, I needed an excuse to go to the beach. And so I bought you this bag. And the bag is sort of a symbol of ethics, or the lack of ethics. Not my ethics, but the fact that it's black and white. And ethics is everything that is not black and is not white. It's somewhere in between. So, 29th birthday, probably for the second or third or maybe more time. Congratulations. But now the question is for you, of course, was this ethic what I now did? I didn't prepare her. She didn't know. I didn't tell her. I said congratulations this morning, and she smiled and said thank you. She didn't expect a gift, but unfortunately, when one woman gets a gift, probably the other one also should have a gift. So I should probably give the other one also a small gift. And what I'm giving now is a wooden shoe. And it's sort of a representing where I'm from, but also a little bit about science. Because when you use a wooden shoe, you increase the size of your foot. So when you're in a swampy area, it's better. And science and ethics about science is often pretending to be in a very swampy area. So, Julie. So obviously, I have a few more of those shoes. So now I'll do something very unethical, because I've now listened to all the presentations this morning and all the questions that were raised. I have not heard one single question from a female in the audience. So the first lady, or anyone who represents the gender they consider themselves mostly represented towards ladies, and I'll maybe be the judge, and I'm impartial to some extent, will get a wooden shoe. Okay, so a question, and it has to be sort of a relevant question. It doesn't have to be a very good question. It's only good if I can answer it at least. Okay, so now you know there are not a lot of you. I mean, you have the chance. So think about that. Okay? You can ask me everything except my tax returns, because I will not show them. Okay. So actually we probably should sing for her, but should we skip that? Because I couldn't find the accents on this. Anyway, so this is happy birthday in Portuguese. I just looked when the network worked again. Anyway, here we go. Ethics and morality, the good citizen. So we're going to talk about the good citizen. I'm going to talk about going way back, where did it all start? And we can do two sort of different sort of areas of this. And one of them is the Eastern sort of philosophy kind of thing, because earlier we talked about sociology and philosophy. And one of them is a fellow from China. His name is Confucius. He's, an old dude. He was from 500 something before BC. So it was a long time ago, 2,600 years ago, as a matter of fact. And he was talking about what we call the explicit rules of good behavior. What you do not, and it's called the silver rule. You can imagine there's also a gold rule, but I'll let you figure that out yourself. What you do not wish for yourself, do not do to others. Okay? So that is the Eastern philosophy. At the same time, and they were not connected yet because the Silk Route was not quite there. You probably know the Silk Route is the sort of the first international trade route going from China, from Xi'an, and going all the way into the present-day Turkey and into Europe. But in the Western philosophy, we had another fellow, and his name was Socrates. This is not a picture of him because we don't even have any pictures, but he was told to be not too handsome, but I guess this guy on the other side is not too handsome either. That's probably the way you have to look in order to become a philosopher. And he was talking about what is called the search for moral virtues. And he was talking about the so-called paradoxical wisdom. To know you're not wise makes you wiser than men who think they are wise. That gave him a lot of problems to say this, because obviously the smart people who thought they were wise, intelligent, got very upset about this because they realized if they said they were intelligent or if they're smart, then they're not all that smart. As you probably have seen on television, there are certain politicians at this point that point out that they're very smart, but it could really be, according to Socrates, not that this particular person would know him, that you're not all that smart. As a matter of fact, both of them got in big trouble. He got in trouble because he influenced the dynasty he lived in the Tang dynasty. That was actually the first bigger reunification of China, and he actually ended up having to, commit suicide, get killed. He had to drink some stuff that was not all too good for him. Both of them turned out to be about 71 years, so I still have a few more good years, and then we'll see which one of the two I have to choose. So, speaking of that, is that really a religion now? Because, I'm talking about philosophy, and when you hear and listen to this, for those of you who are religious, it might sound almost like religion, You have to behave the right way, you have to do the right way. The difference between the religion, and we can take the Buddhism, the Eastern, you can always find these nice quotes. If we fail to look after others when they need help, who will look after us? Or we can take the Western part of this. This would be then the Pope. And he said at some point, we have the duty to do good. The big difference between sort of the philosophy version and the religious version of it is that in the philosophy, they don't talk much about the punishment if you do bad things. They talk about the good things, but they don't tell you what happens if you do bad things. Scientists, in many ways, are then closer actually to the religious interpretation of ethics, because we'll tell you not only what is bad to do, but we will also tell you that there is a punishment if you do that. So in many ways, our interpretation of the ethical rules are closer to the religious part of it. Be very careful. Don't turn this around and say that physics is like a religion. Okay? I've done that. I did that when I became a full professor, and you have to give a speech at the university. I said something to that effect, and it turned out it got picked up by some religious people, and they told us, of course, physics is bogus because they claim they're a religion. Anyway, but this guy, he's an Argentinian, so they will say anything. So we can always get the right quotes. But he, for instance, also said, I love tango and I used to dance when I was young. So it's just a matter of how you choose it. How do I know this? You know that he's actually a trained chemist. He's a scientist. He used to be a scientist. And as a matter of fact, I have met him personally, and that was because he is also very interested in the denuclearification of the world, meaning getting rid of nuclear weapons. And obviously that dates back to the time that there was a lot of tension between Brazil and Argentina. Both of them gave up, and he knew about this, and he's very much interested in that. So the Vatican, being as a country, has actually signed a UN treaty together with other countries. Anyway, going back now to the ethics. So I said, in many ways, it's a little bit like a religion. And whenever you have something like this, you probably also have a website for this. And one of these is called the Committee on Publishing Ethics. I don't know about FISREV, and we didn't discuss it, but I know within other publishers, there are a few of the editors that are members of this Committee on Publishing Ethics. They get together once in a while in Britain or in the UK or in some other, or in Asia. But there's also a lot of web seminars. And what they have is best practices and guides on publishing ethics. So I would definitely recommend, if you want to know about this, go to this particular site. Don't go to cope.org or cope.com or whatever, because you'll end up in totally different things. But there you can find a whole number of things. Not all of it, by the way, you can see. Some of them you have to be a member in order to do it, but a lot of the best practices and a lot about what you can do in order to avoid these issues are shown on the website. So I can highly recommend to go and look there. Okay? In many ways, ethics is like riding a bike. It's very difficult to explain how to do it, but once you do it, you know how to do it. And it doesn't matter whether you're riding in Beijing or you're riding in Amsterdam. It's a matter of, knowing the traffic laws to some extent, and then keep the balance and keep going. Okay? So if I ask you, without moving your arms, explain to me how you ride a bicycle, it's very difficult. And it's the same thing with ethics. It can be very difficult to explain, but I'll try it anyway. Okay? And the way I'll do it is to try to explain some of these differences. So I said with this particular bag, I said it's not black, it's not white. What I want you to focus on are these two squares here. Okay? And if you just look at them, they don't look the same color, right? Because we have a different perception, because there is a black background here and there's a white here. Now if I flip them a little bit, now they look different again. If they flip them one more time, they'll look even more different. So we have to be very, very very, very careful whenever we make these decisions, because we're looking at maybe at the same problem, but our background, the reference that we are using, is slightly different. So you have to be very careful with this. And we try our best, we being the editorial staffs and all the people involved in scientific publishing, we try our best to be as impartial and even-minded when we do these decisions. Nevertheless, once in a while, we make a bad decision, and the worst decision you can make is not to change the bad decision, okay? So whenever you find that you've been treated unfairly, whether it's an ethical issue or another issue, try to convince the people to change their mind. And if you're right, they will change their mind, okay? Now, I will now not go through all of these, but there is a whole bunch of these ground rules of scientific publishing. There is about good science, science ethics, authorship. Well, we've talked a little bit about the authorship, the ownership of material. Who owns it? Who owns the data? Can you just use them if they're not your data? Conflict of interest, for instance, if you're if you work in making a new medicine, but at the same time you publish about this medicine and you get paid by a pharmaceutical company, there could be some conflicts of interest. You should tell people about this when you publish this, okay? If you don't, you have a problem. And if it's found out, you have a problem. Salami publishing, who knows what salami publishing means? Has anyone ever heard that term? So that is what was just talked about. That is the smallest entity you can make. This is a very thin slice of a bigger sausage. You could have made a very nice, good, fat publication out of, but you decided to slice it in very, very, very thin slices. So instead of having one big article that would have a huge impact, you probably will get 10 articles that have no impact, okay? Tomorrow I'll be talking about what do I mean by impact. I don't mean impact factor. I'm talking about getting citations, okay? So peer reviewing, fair peer reviewing, and even research fraud. We'll talk about people who have done some really bad things, and it can take a long while, but eventually probably most people will be found out. So stakeholders in the in this process can be the funding agency, the academic institution, the authors, the publishers, the editors, the reviewers, the libraries, and the readers. Okay, so now I'll talk about, today I'll talk about the authors and the co-authors. That would be you. I assume most of you have been either a co-author or an author or aspire to become an author or co-author. I'll talk about the editor. the editor, that would be me, or that would be Lawrence, or it could be Julia, it could be a number of people. There are many of them. I'll show you more numbers about this. And we'll talk about the reviewers, and obviously we also should talk a little bit about the publishers. So, okay. Well, that's a typical example of fake science, okay? And unfortunately, these people knew it already because they saw it in São Paulo. So this is something that looks so believable that you assume this looks right? Yeah. And it looks so believable because I put it in there, and I put it at a point where it could have been. Because obviously I would be so, I'm a physicist, I'm stupid. So I would forget to plug in my computer. Don't worry, I have enough time for 5 hours of a presentation. This is fake. Okay? Just to keep you sharp. Okay? So always be sharp. Remind yourself, is this for real or could it be fake? But I promise you, the rest of my presentation is to the best of my ability, not fake. Okay? No more jokes about ethics and no more, well, at least I will not try to do anything bad. Okay. Now, going back to these publishers, because that's when I clicked on it and then this came up. Publishers. Why would a publisher be interested in doing unethical things? Well, of course they would not, unless they do things that is to the benefit of themselves and for the rest of the community not very beneficial. And they are called predatory journals and predatory conferences. Some of you will eventually, when you've published a couple of papers, you will eventually get invited by obscure journals, or at least journals with names that you have not recently heard of, or maybe never heard of, and they'll invite you to submit your paper, and for very few dollars, you can actually have a paper published in their journal. Unfortunately, these journals are only there to make money. They don't do much of a peer review, if any. They will often be connected to a predatory conference. That is, you get invited as an invited speaker to a conference. Well, downside is you have to pay your own travel, you have to pay the hotel, you have to pay for the conference registration, but you are invited speaker. There are other conferences that will also do that. But once you get invited, first of all, ask yourself, be honest, go to the mirror and say to yourself, why did they invite me? What do I have to tell that they think that I could be of benefit? Because often they will ask you to show anything you want when you go there. So they don't even know what you're doing. They're just asking you to come. And the bottom line is, when you get there, you'll get often to a hotel very close to an airport, and there will be sessions that are so widely broad that you could have someone talking about dental fillings, and the next one would talk about, high temperature or superconductivity, and then there would be someone talking about nursing homes or whatever. Totally, well, they're not illegal, but they're not really doing you any favor. Because you've been invited to this conference, but the conference is bogus, okay? And so it's a waste of time and it's a waste of your money. So naming and shaming, that is, you tell about someone. I'll show you one of these publishers. And unfortunately, quite a few of them are actually based in India. Why? Because manpower is relatively inexpensive. Their English is very good. So they can make very good sounding and very well sounding invitation letters, so you believe it. So one of them is called the International Journal of Current Research in Science, Engineering, and Technology. And I invite you to actually go to this website and take a look at these papers. These poor guys have paid about $300 to have their papers published. But the papers will never get cited because they're not being indexed by any of the larger indices that would be Web of Science or Scopus. Okay? So they will never count towards your age index or all the other things we'll talk about tomorrow. Has anyone here ever been invited to publish in one of these journals? Did you do it? Of course not. I'm not that stupid. Good. But just be careful, okay? Because it's very tempting, it's inexpensive, it looks like it's legit. It is legit to the extent that there is a journal, it's on the website, it's open access, you pay for it, but it doesn't do you any good. And you're giving away your data because you also sign off your copyrights to this, okay? Now, having said that, then I'll zoom in, now going from the publishers, I'll go into the authors and the co-authors. Before I do that, I would like to go back and ask, is there anyone who has a question? No questions? You don't want to shoe? Okay. Too bad. Authorship. Okay, so now I'll go through the various parts of this. So we've talked about the authorship, and I'll tell you some about the ethical issues about that. We've done that extensively, but you could omit authors. That would be unethical. You could add someone during the process of having the paper that may or may not have contributed to the paper, but it could be, and as a matter of fact, in China, you can now buy a co-authorship of a paper for a couple of €1,000, okay? They'll guarantee you that the paper will be published. What they do is they wait until it looks like the paper will be published. Then they announce that they will sell you a co-authorship of the paper. And then you sign up, you pay your fees, it's going very fast, and then they'll resubmit the paper but tell the editor that in the process of having revised their paper, unfortunately they had to include someone else because he or she was very important to the revisions that the paper had undergone. And therefore, he should be included. Okay? Cost you $2,000, €2,000, sorry, roughly. And you're a co-author. And the paper is being published, and it will be published. And depending on, when I say €2,000, it actually depends on the impact factor of the given journal in the given area, okay? And it's done very professionally, okay? There's actually someone in between who sells these. So it's not done directly. Mediators. So if you get invited for a small fee to get your name on a publication, don't do it. It's unethical, and eventually probably someone will find out about it. And as a matter of fact, my journal, which I will not talk anything about today, a little bit tomorrow, will not accept these changes. So it's waste of money because you've already paid it and you don't get included anyway. Because what we will tell them is that either you retract the paper, you resubmit it, and then we'll send it through the review process again, and it may or may not get published. They don't want to take that chance, so therefore they tell the other guy he cannot be a co-author. You can also delete people on the author list, okay? You could change the author affiliation. That's actually an issue because sometimes people like to pretend that they're coming from a more prestigious university or more fancy-sounding university, and sometimes they've not even been at the university. They've not even been employed by the university. That's unfortunately also an issue. And obviously changing the order of the contributors could also be some issues. We've talked about that extensively, so I will not go into that. And then, of course, the corresponding authors. And last but not least, acknowledging contributors. All of these things can lead to ethical issues. And once again, it's not black, it's not white, it's gray. It's just a matter of how gray is it. And once again, talk to your surrounding and try to have what we call a moral compass that is directed in the right direction, okay? Now, going on with the authors. In the research part of it, obviously, there could be unethical research methods. It's a little bit difficult to give examples in physics, but you could imagine in some medical sciences there could be unethical research methods. And even maybe in physics you could have some unethical research methods. You could also have research standards violations. That would be for any typical field of science, we have some standard methods we do. That could be the way we handle the statistics, what have you. If you violate that and you don't disclose that you've done it a little bit different than you would normally do, then it's an ethical issue, okay? Because you have to give full disclosure of what you've done. Why? Because the fundamentals of science is that we expect people to be able to repeat the experiment. Obviously, when you do sociology experiments with very small groups of people, as was earlier said, it might not be representative, but at least be upfront and say that I'm not for 100% sure that this would always give the same result. But for most physicists, when we publish something, we expect it to be an experiment that someone else, no matter where they live, would be able to repeat. Yeah? Research data manipulations. Well, we are going to the worst and worst cases now. Obviously, if you have data and you're plotting a line and you realize, wait a second, that point is way too low. Let's move it up a little bit. Data manipulation, that's not the way it's done, okay? Omitting negative results, meaning, once again, you've made these data, you've measured them, and all of them is just way off the chart. And you decide, no good, I'll just leave it out. You're omitting it. You don't show it. There could be other things, and it might not be an ethical issue when you actually write the paper. That is the fact that there is a hidden research or instrument error. But it is an ethical issue at the point where you discover that there is an issue in this particular instrument. It could, for instance, be that you're measuring something and that turned out to be an intrinsic magnetic field in the instrument that influenced your data, but you didn't know and you thought it was all shielded mu metal, for those of you who know what that is, that there was no magnetic field. Once you discover that, and you don't send in an erratum or corrigendum, as it's normally called, then it's an unethical behavior. Okay? What are the most common?
The most common fault.
That's a little bit difficult to say. I mean, generally speaking, first of all, I don't even pretend that I know all the ethical issues that are in the various, not even my own journal, by no means. I've been now for less than a week in Brazil. Our journal has, as a journal, about 16,000 submissions per year, just one journal. So it's a big journal. And I've had 2 ethical cases now being raised, one of them being an author that was not included in the author list, and he claims that it's his data. And the other one being that someone that I'll show later on has actually published the same paper essentially twice. Okay? So that's in 1 week. So based on these things, people complaining about not being included is relatively common. And unfortunately, it's something that is very, very difficult for a journal to find out whether it's true or not. Because you ask them to submit their lab papers, the notebooks that we are talking about, whether they're on paper or whatever, doesn't matter. As a matter of fact, most of you probably do this now. I mean, we are old guys, so we did it back then, with a real book. But keep these reports, okay? Because prove that you actually did the experiments. Prove that you did it if you are not included on the paper. So that's probably one of the ones that we get the most. Unfortunately, if we cannot resolve that problem, ultimately we have to ask the institute where they came from, and they have to resolve it internally. And unfortunately, and we'll get back to that tomorrow, about the discussion of well, we already did that. Are you willing to take the risk as a young person to discuss this? And unfortunately, it turns out that the young person would often not get the benefit of the doubt within the institute. Unfortunately, we can't do it much better as a journal. No question? You don't want a shoe? No, because it has to be a female. But he might get a shoe. Are you sort of more gender? No, never mind. Sorry, that's. For those of you who look into it, I work for the military in the Netherlands. It would surprise you that we actually have transgenders serving in the military, people that are in the transition. So you always have to notice what uniform they're on, because then you know where they're in the transition. But anyway, totally different story. Undisclosed conflicts of interest. I already said that once, but this is a slightly different point of it. Submission process. Obviously, you could do it multiple times, simultaneously. Send it to 3 different journals, because I would like to have it in Journal A because that's the best one, but they probably will not accept it. So also do to B and C. that is not a good idea. I mean, obviously, if you would submit it to FISREP letters and FISREP B at the same time, and FIS applied, they would know, okay? Obviously, if you submit it to FISREP B and you submit it to my journal, Applied Surface Science, we would not know because we don't share the same databases. But ultimately, we would know, and then the two of us would decide how we're going to punish you. And I'll show you later on how we do that. Resubmission of already accepted papers. That's another one that is actually relatively frequently occurring. That is that people thought that that paper did not get into the right journal. It should have been in a better journal. So they often go for a lower impact journal, whether that means it's better or not. We'll talk about that tomorrow. And then they try to submit it to a higher impact journal, and obviously they will probably make it a little bit more smooth, but ultimately you will be found out. Reusing parts of an already published paper. Also here, that might or might not be an ethical issue. If you use part of it, but you put it in quotation marks and you give the proper reference, it might not be an issue. But since you've given away the copyright probably to a different publisher, you have to ask this publisher for the permission to do that. And all publishers, I think, will give you that permission. We are pretty good about that. We don't mind that. We think it's great that you actually refer to your papers in the other ones, but you have to refer to them, okay? Don't just cut and paste. Oh, that was a brilliant piece of wording we put there. And maybe not even from your own work, but for somebody else. Don't do that. Even though I know English is not your native language, and sometimes you find sort of a sentence that you think is so brilliant, I need to use this. Oh man, they really explained what I meant. If you do, put it in quotation marks and give the proper reference, and obviously the people would not be too upset about it. Of course, if you take 2 pages of their publications, they probably will be pretty upset about it. So once again, it's not black, it's not white, it's somewhere in between. So you have to feel yourself, how much can I permit?
Sorry, Eric.
Yes.
This is also true also for the figures, for example, of the papers.
I'm sorry, this also?
This is also true
for the
figures,
absolutely.
not only the text. I think it's, sometimes figures
I just need some
contain
water,
a lot of,
yeah. Okay, yeah, it's absolutely true for the figures also. As a matter of fact, I'll show later on, there are programs that can actually search and find the textual overlap between the various, and sometimes even the conceptual overlap. Different concept, but conceptual means the idea behind it. They can find that, but figures are very difficult to compare. But actually, some of the algorithms that Google are using to connect us by showing our faces and finding them on the internet can now be used actually for figures and are currently being tried out by various companies.
Because figures are very easy to be readapted from one paper to the other by just changing colors or captions.
Don't listen to this man, okay?
No, I know.
He doesn't know what he's talking about.
No.
You're absolutely right.
It's complicated.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And as a matter of fact, I had a colleague of mine, a very dear colleague. His name was Franz Harbacher, and he unfortunately passed away in 2010. And he was paralyzed in the last part of his life, and he could spend hours and hours on his computer, voice activated, comparing XPS spectra or spectra and figures, and rotate them and change them from black to white and all kinds of things. And you would come into in his home, and he would be so happy because he had found someone who had been cheating. But unfortunately, we don't all have that much time to do that. You're absolutely right. At some point, someone will find out, and then you will get punished. And you'll be punished big time. So in that respect, in many ways, it is a religion, but it's a very, very forceful sort of punishment you get. So don't do that either. If you do, don't forget to refer to it, and don't forget to get the copyright. Most publishers has a very quick link on their homepage. All you have to click, tell exactly what submission you would like to use, and then you can actually reuse the figure that is on there. Okay, so if you ever need help for that, either ping the editorial office or one of the editors. Submitting under a false identity. We also get that. That is that people, for some reason or another, have done bad things in the past. They decided to change their name. Sometimes they use, a different last name, or they tend to use a different email address because some way or another we're upset with them. Sometimes people are too stupid because they change the name but they don't change the email. We hope and we try to find out anyway. Another thing that happens often in the submission process, and later on in the workshop you'll be told extensively about this, you're not only asked, but you're required often to submit the names of potential reviewers. It has to be a peer reviewer, meaning it is one of your peers in terms of the science, but it should not be a friend of you because we don't want any conflict of interest with this particular person. So don't show the names of your colleagues from the same institute or people that you have published with extensively recently. But the worst thing you can do is actually submit suggestions for reviewers that don't even exist. We get that. We get people that submit 3 reviewers. None of them have any track record in science. They are nowhere to be found. So we have people who check this, okay? Don't do that. Because it means that you're trying to fake the review process because you hope that we'll invite 1, 2, or maybe even 3 of these suggested reviewers, and they will get back probably a review with a few changes, but it's a brilliant paper, and that it should be published. Another one is chasing the reviewers. We all think about who could be the reviewer when we have that. Lance will probably talk about that tomorrow, I guess. And we'll most often be wrong when we guess that. But last but not least, don't chase them down outside of the system. You'll be told how to reply to that, but don't try to approach them and ask them for favors. Okay? Don't do that. It's unethical. And once again, these undisclosed conflict of interest are important to mention. Now we've talked about you a long time, about the authors and the co-authors. Some of you have been reviewers, I've been told. And now we'll talk a little bit about the unethical behavior or possible unethical behavior of reviewers and maybe even of editors, okay? Because editors are also human beings and sometimes they can do bad things. The editorial process is a little bit like this guy running down the road, and first he meets someone with a sword and then a club and all these people who wants to kill him, and ultimately if he makes it through all of them, the paper will be accepted. So reviewers can be nice, they can be not so nice. And when you get the reply with a review, most often you think that they're not so nice. So there could be a conflict of interest from the editor's point of view. Sorry, editor or reviewer. Could be a collaborative friend or foe. Foe is someone who's an enemy. So if you really hate someone, the likelihood that you will give them a good review is probably less. So you could also not be an expert in the field. That happens. If you receive a paper or an invitation to review a paper, and you look at the abstract and you look at the title, because often you only look at those 2 things, and you think, oh, that paper is a good paper, I would like to review that, and then you get the whole paper, you read the whole paper, and you realize, wait a second, I don't understand it. Well, at that point it could be because you're not an expert, or it could also be because it's not written very clearly. If the first is the case, then you should send it back to the editor and tell them, listen, sorry, I made a mistake. I thought I was an expert. I'm not an expert anymore, but I do think I know someone who could do it. Then you'll make the editor very, very, very happy. Giving a poor review grade on purpose is also unethical. It doesn't necessarily have to be an enemy of yours, but it could be that, they're competing for the same kind of grant or what have you. And then on purpose giving them a poor review would be unethical. Once again, the other way around, the reviewer should not contact the author. So most journals these days work what is called single blind review. That is, the reviewer will know the name of the author, but the author will not know the name of the reviewer. Okay? There are a few journals that try to do what is called double blind, that the reviewer doesn't know the name of the author and the other way around. It doesn't work all that well because most of the reviewers will, based on the information they get in the paper, find out who is the author anyway. And that's the reason why most journals have decided not to waste the time and the money on trying to make it double blind, but only single blind. So that means the reviewer will know the author's name, but it would be unethical for them to, outside the system of the editorial process, to contact the authors and ask them for something. For instance, oh, you know what? I have 2 papers in this area. They're great papers. You should include them as reference. Unethical, okay? Using the information you receive for own purposes is also unethical. Sounds strange, but by that I mean if you start publishing something based on the information you've obtained, that's unethical, okay? You can do that when it's been published. You can't do it during the review process. Bias towards ethnic and other background of author, whether you're from Brazil or you're from Argentina or whatever, for the journal and the reviewer, it shouldn't matter. It doesn't matter, okay? And if you, for some reason or another, suspect that there is a bias against you, let it be known to the editor. They would try to help you as much as possible to get rid of any potential bias. Promoting own unrelated work, what I just said, if in a review you tell the authors, oh yeah, great work, but a lot of people have done this work, especially this particular group, and then you list 10 of your own papers, that is also unethical. If there is one paper that is really, really essential and is not mentioned, you might want to do that. But it's also a good idea then to mention 1 or 2 other papers by other groups that could be included. Unnecessarily delaying the work, meaning that you're just taking your time because, who cares? And the longer it takes, the better and the faster I can get my paper through. Now, this was about the editors and this was about the reviewers. Actually, most publishers these days use a plagiarism tool called Authenticate. It's also used in high schools, even in the US, to find out whether they're copying papers from others. But it's used for, and it's based actually on the Scopus database. And Scopus is from Elsevier, but is by now the biggest database of them all. It's bigger than Web of Science. So that means that we cover many more things than just the ones from Web of Science. And as a matter of fact, Authenticate goes even further. They also include and mine and crawl, as it's called, the various websites where theses are published, because even theses are considered by many to be a publication because it has an ISBN number. So a lot of these journals will find this overlap if you copy huge chunks of text out of your own thesis. And if that thesis has been copyrighted by either your own university or yourself, there might be some issues about that. Most often they're resolved because we convince ourselves that it's just a PhD thesis not being published anywhere else, but nevertheless we need to clarify that, and you should actually refer to that in your paper because it would be an ISBN number, which is an identification number of your book. If you're reviewed for Elsevier, I should say, and I should mention that, I show the logo of Elsevier in many places. I'm not employed by Elsevier, okay? I have a normal job. I'm just like Lauwens, a professor in physics. So this is not what I do 24/7. I'm sort of what they call the lead editor. In our case, we call it the editor-in-chief, but it's essentially the same thing. I do this part-time. And in our case, we have 26 regular editors and 5 managing editors. And they are all scientists in their own right in this particular field. So if you do this for Elsevier, you get free access for a month to all content published by Elsevier. You get access to Scopus. And as a matter of fact, you can even link the various PDFs, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if it so happens that you ever get to a position where you think there is an ethical issue, a violation, you feel violated, or you feel that other people have been violated, how do you go about that? How do you complain? Where do you complain? Well, typically, you would normally contact the journal through the homepage or directly to the editor-in-chief. There will always be a link that says, email to the editor-in-chief or email to the editorial office. We all have that. And some even have groups of people doing this. And what happens then is that the editor-in-chief of the special ethics group within the publisher will research the complaint. And depending on the complaint and the kinds of information we get, and I'm just showing here 3 of the journals, PhysRevB, Physical Review Applied, and my own journal here. The outcome of the investigation could be that the complaint is directed at the right journal, but it could be multiple journal academic misconduct. It's been published in various places. And if there are two papers published, the same paper published in 2 different journals, the 2 editors will make an agreement. That is, typically, that the one that has been published first will remain, and the second one will be retracted. I'll get back to that in a second. That means if you publish twice and you go for the low impact first and then you try the high impact and both get published, the high impact one will get retracted, meaning never exist. If it is very, very bad, maybe both of them will be retracted, depending on how the editor-in-chief feels about what you've done. It could be that the complaint is not justified, or it could be that we cannot prove it. If we can't prove it, then there might be an ethical issue, but since we cannot prove it, we'll leave it as it is. When uncertain, we will not lean over and say it's probably unethical. It could also be that the complaint is malicious, meaning you want to hurt someone else. And you probably think that sounds stupid, but it happens relatively frequently. That is, that someone is very upset with someone else, often someone they have collaborated with in the past, even some of them having been married in the past, and then they complain about their ethical behavior. And after a lot of man hours, because it costs a lot of man hours, each of these cases cost 10, 15, 20 man hours of various people to sort it out, we found out that it's malicious, and then we get really, really upset with the person, okay? It could also be that the complaint is partly justified, and if it's partly justified, we will lead to one or 2 things. It can either be a corrigendum, that means that the person will actually have to...
Can I ask a question
Yes.
about the malicious complainant?
Yeah.
If you can prove that this was malicious, does
Right.
something happen to the person who raises such a false accusation?
Yeah.
Okay, so what could be the consequence for him?
Okay. Once again, I'm not employed by Elsevier, so I'm not saying this on behalf of Elsevier. I don't know how it is by PhysRev. So what we do is we actually put a notification in the author. We have a small hidden block that we can put comments in. And we'll put in there that this author has filed a malicious complaint about someone else, and even give the reference to the emails. And that means that when this author will try to publish a paper next time, they'll have a tough time because we will look very, 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 very closely. And it most often means that people will have a very tough time getting their things published afterwards. Unfortunately, I cannot say this on behalf of Elsevier, because Elsevier, as a commercial publisher, and maybe PhysRev is the same, does not condone this, meaning they don't really allow us to do this. But we do it anyway because all of us are professors in various places in the world, and we just hate this, okay? So we don't publish this anywhere, but don't do it because you will be in big trouble within this particular journal and a number of our sister journals, okay? And obviously, we'll let it know within the editorial teams. So, but once again, I would like to emphasize it's not the policy of Elsevier, it's the policy of the editors, but that's how we agree to go about it. Is that fair? I find it's pretty fair because we don't, announce it in public that they have done it, but at least we make sure that we know that they have an axe to grind, as it's called in American English. If the problem is so big that there's nothing to be done about it, the paper will be retracted. That is the worst thing that can happen to you. And how does that look like? It's the ultimate punishment. So, once again, it is like a religion. There is a punishment. And in this particular case, there's no, praying or anything you can do to get rid of it. No. This is it. You will have your paper retracted. And it will be there forever. Okay? Back in the days, when we had real journals, meaning on paper, obviously we would not ask the librarians to go out and pull out the papers, and we would not ask them to put a stamp on it or whatever. There would be a collection of retracted papers, but that's it. Now these days, it will stay on the web page of the particular journal, and it will say retracted. And it will refer to the retraction notice, why it was retracted. For those of you young people who get tempted, I will tell you, if you have a retracted paper, just one, and we've just heard that you are responsible for all the co-authors you have, and that means that a whole group can get hurt by just one person being very, very irresponsible. And if you have just one retracted paper, the chance of getting a permanent position in any reputable university is almost zero. Okay? Don't do that. Chances are nada. Okay? And so this particular person, they were all, well, most of them were permanent people, so they're still there. They still live. And normally I should actually put out their names, but apparently this got a little bit down. But anyway. And this happens for a good-sized journal in about, I would say, 0.1%. No, that would be less than that. Probably 0.1% of the case, 10 minus 4 of all papers that are being published. So that means it happens, for a big journal, once or twice a year, the papers are being retracted. Okay. So in this particular case, it will stay there on Science Direct forever, and you will see it forever. So when you go to the library, electronic library, you can find retracted papers. And there are actually websites dedicated, because there are some people that really loves to collect these. So you can go and find them. You can find all the silly stories about how stupid people can be. And you will find that some of these, if you're an editor, these websites will contact you as an editor asking for more personal information about the stories behind and things like that. We don't give that, okay? We leave it at this. That is the ethical way to go about it. Unfortunately, I've seen that some other editors go about it in a different way because they are so upset about this, because these things takes a lot of manpower. Anyway, for you, there is some websites. In this particular case, this is from Elsevier. FISREV has a similar, Springer, another big publisher, Kluver, Francis and Taylor. We all have these, and you will find that there's various things that you can do in the process of this, learning how to do things better on the way. So now I'll do something that is a little bit unethical. I'll make some advertisement for a conference that my journal is organizing next year in Pisa. It's kind of funny that you have a symbol of failed architecture and that being used as sort of the symbol for a conference, but nevertheless, this conference will take place in June of 2019. And as a matter of fact, in this in this conference, there'll be a special session for relatively young people to give oral presentations, and they will actually get, just like I told you about the predatory conferences, we'll actually invite you if you submit a good proposal for a oral presentation. We might even give you a letter of invitation. I don't know what it works out in Brazil, but I know in some countries that means that you get a bit better funding and a better chance to go there. And if you need anything special, because we are scientists like everybody else, and we are for the scientists, and we love to have very young people, and there will be even a visit to the gravitational laboratory that is also based in Italy. And with this, I would like to thank you and just remind you there is no right way to do the wrong thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric. Are there questions? Yes, of course. I mean, don't forget the. So do you?
He left.
Yeah, he left. I mean, yeah, he got
Well,
offended.
he would have gotten one, but I'm trying to get someone fell asleep.
So questions, guys. I mean, this. No, he's here.
Ladies, come on.
Yeah, ladies and.
How about you? Don't you have a question? So any question?
Any question?
What is my favorite color? Well, obviously you can tell. Well, you can't tell from this, but you know. No. Well, obviously this is yellow. Orange would be. Who said that? Did you say that? Okay. Orange is the color of the Dutch football team, as you probably know. Don't ask me why, actually. Well, actually, I can tell you why. That's because it used to be red in the color of the flag, and then, well, whatever. No, it's actually red, because our journal front page is red. And in China, red is very, very important, and blue is not so important. And we have two journals. One is called Surface Science, the other one called Applied Surface Science. So I always tell them, you know, you can choose yourself what journal you want to submit to, but just think about the color of the front page. And then they choose for the red one. So that was your question? Okay.
How would you consider in terms of ethics when someone copies her or his own work?
That's a good question. So you get the shoe, because I can also answer that question. So that's an even better question. That's called self-plagiarism, which is actually the wrong word, because plagiarism means that you really copy somebody else, but you're doing it yourself. But what you're trying to do actually is to get 2 times the credit for something you only did once. So it is unethical, and especially if you try to publish this twice. Unfortunately, there are cases where you almost will be forced to do that. One of them being, obviously, if it's in your thesis has an ISBN number. I don't know whether your thesis here will get an ISBN number. Do you know what an ISBN number is? Okay, so they do get an ISBN number. So sometimes you're forced to do that because obviously your thesis, you want to have also the real publications out of that. So that is in some way a self-plagiarism, but you cover that by referring to your own thesis and when it was published, et cetera, because it's actually considered to be published. However, there is also cases where you sometimes go to a conference and there will be a conference proceedings, and that can be a very, very brief report of what you've done. So just the essence of what you've done, and sometimes you want to expand on that. How much you can do that and expand on that, and whether it becomes self-plagiarism, is not black, it's not white, it's somewhere in between. Obviously, if it almost contains all the essential things of the experiment, et cetera, and you don't add anything essential to it, then it's self-plagiarism. Yeah? Yes?
So third possibility where people tend to do self-plagiarism is if from the same research project or from the same experiment you have more than one publication. So the methods section, then they say, well, but this is what I did. So I did it, I wrote it, now how can I write it differently? But still that doesn't help. Try to reword it, because even though the experiment was same for that particular manuscript, you have a different research question in mind. Otherwise you won't have 2 different manuscripts. So even for the method section, it's not allowed to use your own methods published in a previous publication in another journal.
So now this is where there will be a slight difference between sort of physics and medical science, because in physics you sometimes, like, if you take a spectrum with a given, in a given way, there are only so many ways to put this, okay? And at some point you know how to put this. And then you do it the same way, but obviously with a different spectrum. Then the essential part, how to do it, is essentially the same. The way what comes out of it might be different. And that often means that the first part of it, you have to just refer to the previous paper and say, we did it just like we did the last time. Of course, if it's essential to know exactly how you did it for this particular paper, you have to repeat it. But don't try to do, we talked about synonyms and try to use different words. There is only one word for an electron, was said, and that also applies to some experiments. As a matter of fact, I don't think that's the case in Brazil, but I know there are some countries where you have shared facilities and you submit the sample, and the sample will come back with an XRD whatever, and then you will get even the explanation of how this was done and the interpretation of that, and they will deliver that text to you. And it's very tempting just to cut and paste that. You have to be careful with that because it will look very much like the other things they have done, and therefore it often will be signaled as being plagiarism because these programs, as I showed you, authenticated will find that. Yeah? More questions? Still have a few more shoes.
I have one.
Come on.
Is there any sort of tool where that you can check your work if there is any sort of similarities to other works, so you can give a proper reference to the other authors? You know what I mean?
Yes, I think I know what
because
you mean.
you said you have the
Authenticate.
Yeah. So the software. So if there is any sort of
well, I mean, there is a
probably.
company called Google. No, I'm serious. It sounds really crazy, but Google in many ways is better at doing that than many other ones.
Okay.
Tomorrow I'll also tell you that unfortunately Google also knows a lot about how you search and what you search for. So sometimes it will give you hits that might not be exactly what you were looking for that day because the day before you'd been looking for a trip to the waterfalls close to the border with Argentina. I don't remember the name right now. And so sometimes they give you the wrong answer. But yes, Google is very good at that. Authenticate obviously is you pay for that, and it's a very expensive piece of software. And so it's used, I think, but you probably know how much, but we're talking serious money per search you would do on that. We're talking $20 or something like per run on these. You would typically pay if you just do one pay. Yeah, many universities has that. So guys, speaking of ethics, should we bend sort of the rules about whether you get a shoe for this gentleman? He's been doing a lot of work today, I've seen. Do you think we should do that, or would that be unethical? Would it make him feel less male if I gave him a shoe?
It's unethical because it's a student of mine.
Any other questions? I still have a few more of the shoes, so I'll give you one, whether you're male, female, old, young, whatever. Good questions. Yeah.
Hi. Regarding the change of names issue, what do you recommend for our women
Oh, yeah,
that
I knew you were going to
got
ask me.
married and already have papers under her single name?
Yeah, I got asked that question, almost the same question, when I was when we were in St. Paul. My suggestion is actually not to get married. But that's not a fair and not a correct way to answer that, and probably unethical to even say that, because I have a daughter who's not married either, but that's besides the point. In this particular case, and what I would suggest, things are getting better. Let me put it this way. That is because we now get unique author identification codes that we can slowly use now to actually identify and follow people, even if they move from one institution to another. So that also means that what your name really is on the paper doesn't matter much. Hopefully the Scopus and the Web of Science, because those are the ones that determines, because what you're thinking of, people will not know that I'm the same person as the other one. So eventually we'll get rid of that problem. Whether you, for that matter, even change, as a matter of fact, someone I've admired for many, many years doing calculations, he decided at the tender age of 60 to have his gender changed. And he was, almost 1.90 meters tall, so he became all of a sudden a very tall woman, but he also decided to change his first name, but he chose the same first letter, so he still had the same one. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is things will get better with that respect. On the other hand, try to keep the name that you had, but you don't have to use it, obviously. So it will not be maybe your legal name anymore, but is the name you use when you publish. As a matter of fact, after the presentation, a lady came down to me and asked me a question the other way around. That is that she had married at a very young, tender age, and she had now divorced, and now she had a problem because, that's probably even more difficult, because then you carry sort of this person's name that you probably don't want to carry anymore. And unfortunately, I could only recommend, it's probably very difficult, but you probably will have to deal with that. I will not throw the shoe, but you will get it, okay? Because if I throw the shoe, probably the guy in front of you will either get it smack in his face or he will steal it. And that would be unethical. Yeah, that's exactly what I mean.
Okay, all right. But we will ever make it to a journal when you submit it? Could you put this on?
Currently, some of these things are being implemented. It's also about all publishers. I'll show you tomorrow, are trying to go back in time also with the publications. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to backtrack some of these because you would like to track people also in terms of their names in the past. That also reminds me. So when you look at your age index, we'll talk about what exactly that is tomorrow. You'll find that there are different sources that can give you that. One of them being Google Scholar. Trust me, Google Scholar is very, very bad at that. And I would either trust the Web of Science or the Scopus to give you a more correct, and maybe not even 100% correct, age index. Okay? Whether you believe in that or not, that's besides the point. I'll try to convince you tomorrow that it's not the only story about scientific indices, but it's the best we have for this moment.
Okay, are there more questions? If not, please.
Thank you.
I only had one, so you'll not get one.
Oh.
No, that was unethical. No. It turns out I had another one.
It's not a problem. Is this software that you use? It is possible to track if you are using several of your own references in a paper or something like this?
You bet.
I'm not doing this, okay?
You bet.
But I know people who unfortunately do.
No, I think
is there any kind of
unfortunately, like the APS, the ACS, and the other publishers, unfortunately, we don't collaborate all that much because to some extent we are also competitors. I would love to have some sort of clearinghouse where we would actually exchange more information about this, because we are getting fooled a lot, and we spend a lot of our resources on things because people think we are stupid. We are naive, but we are not stupid. Yeah?
Yeah. I was wondering about this question right now, and I would like what you think about it. With all this attention and pressure nowadays on ethics and plagiarism, what do you have any concerns about writers getting too much conservative when writing? You know, being afraid or play outside the box?
Or you mean, always trying to be so brave that you play it very safe?
Yeah, that's what I mean.
No, I'm not afraid of that. As a matter of fact, when we look at the numbers in terms of productions per scientist working in given fields, the number of publications increased dramatically. Inherently, I expect that a paper represents about 1 man-year of research. So when we talk about someone has a group and they publish 60 papers per year where they're a co-author, that means that the group probably should have about 60 people contributing to this, or collaborators they are outside. So typically a paper, you could think about that yourself, has to represent about 1 to, well, maybe sometimes only half a man year if you're lucky, but for typical papers, there would be 1 man year of work. Obviously, you have a big group, there can be many papers coming out of this group. So when you say, should we be conservative? Well, we should be concerned about the number of papers being published, because it also means that we can't, as a scientist, keep up with it. And now these days, even with the electronic publishing, I know that FISREF are now differentiating between the various journals, but in many ways, when we search for these things, we don't see the journals so much anymore. We just see this Scopus or whatever, Web of Science, and we search for the given keywords we want, or maybe even Google, and then we hit a journal. And what journal we hit depends on whether the keywords we gave and the search engine we used. That also means that the Googles are becoming more and more important in terms of what you and I read in terms of science. Because a lot of us, even us publishers, editors, use Google, because unfortunately, the Scopus and the Web of Science, their search engines, and the way they access their own database is worse than Google. The Googles are really smart people. They outsmart almost anyone. Unfortunately, it also means that when you search for something, you might give a different answer than your neighbor. And that is unfortunately the danger. That is that we will all get the things to see that Google thinks that we should see. Whereas the Web of Science and the Scopus, they give you the same answer whether you do it or you do it. So tomorrow I'll touch a little bit about that, because we all produce information. You all sit here with a smartphone. While you're sitting here, even though most of you have not been WhatsApping or whatever, as far as I've seen today, nevertheless you've generated. Have you done it? Will you admit to it? Yeah, I could. But if you want, I can give you, well, okay, so I should tell, in the Netherlands, I work for the military. I used to, sorry, until October 1. So I can tell you a little bit about this, and if you look on BBC News or whatever, you'll see that the military, the Dutch military today has announced something about the Russians trying to hack into various things. What I'm trying to say is, yes, I know how you can do it anonymously. Is that the way to go? Well, it's very cumbersome, and it will actually limit sometimes the things you see, because it works both ways. They do it because they think they will help you, okay? And they might even help you because they find the right paper for you. But once in a while, because you don't know what the algorithm is to find that, you might end up on the wrong page. Oh, sorry, yeah, see? Now you know why I shouldn't throw that up. You would have been hit.
More questions?
Coffee!
Yes, so before coffee, actually, we will take the group picture right outside, and then we will reconvene here in, I would say, 15 minutes. We are a bit late. Would it be okay? And before that, let's thank Eric again. Thank you.
Thank you very much.